Day 4, Round 2 of the Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry began with a further cross-examination of veteran political activist UC Kwayana by attorney-at-law Basil Williams. Mr. Kwayana refuted claims by Mr. Williams that Dr. Walter Rodney harbored personal hatred for former late leader Forbes Burnham and was planning to overthrow the regime by violent means. Several writings were submitted into evidence, including a speech made by Dr. Rodney in July 1979 titled The Struggle Goes On, and a book written by CLR James titled Walter Rodney and the Question of Power, among others. Lawyer representing the interests of brother of the late Walter Rodney, Donald Rodney, who was in the car when the explosive disguised as a walkie-talkie exploded, established that it was a plot by Sergeant Gregory Smith to assassinate Dr. Rodney.
Williams, during his cross-examination of veteran political activist UC Kwayana, sought to establish that Dr. Walter Rodney was inciting violence against the Forbes Burnham regime, quoting excerpts from a speech made by Dr. Rodney in 1979, included in the booklet titled The Struggle Goes On. However, this notion was strongly objected to by Mr. Kwayana, who, while admitting that Rodney was referring to Forbes Burnham, said the intent was not to invoke a violent insurrection.
They must go. Loud applause. The PNC must go. Loud applause and cheering. And they must go by any means necessary. Do you agree with me in that paragraph which I just read? And in particularly the words, "we finish with all that," followed by, "they must go, the PNC must go, and they must go by any means necessary," suggests clearly that Dr. Rodney considered that all the other alternatives weren't working, and he's speaking about recourse to violence.
No, I do not think that is the only inference.
Again, I suggest to you that that was what Dr. Rodney was telling the large crowd was the last option. All else that failed, we finish with that, we shall resort to violence in order to ensure they must go, the PNC must go, by any means necessary.
Chair, I think that it is somewhat unfair to the witness to put this against the background that the next sentence specifically addresses the issue of violence by saying they have been accusing us
No,
of
sir,
fomenting
I'm
violence.
objecting to this. The witness
I'm
will
really
have his
objecting
chance
to
to
this,
cross-examine.
But at least before you object, we must hear what is it that he's saying.
No, but I'm saying, sir, it's a matter of procedure. The witness, from just in beginning, is something that he could deal with when he is examining Mr. Kwayana.
Okay.
But I don't think it's proper for him to interrupt me.
Let us hear what he's saying, and we may then be able to agree or disagree.
He's
with
talking
him.
about another paragraph. That's something he could deal with when he's examining.
Okay, let us hear what Mr. Pilgrim is saying.
My objection, Chair, is that the council is specifically putting to this witness that there is a desire to foment violence. And the very next sentence, which he stops short of, specifically states that he is being accused of that and how he proposes to address violence, and that he is not engaging in assassination, specifically addresses that. So to put it without putting it in his context is unfair. That's our submission, sir.
An article authored by CLR James titled Walter Rodney and the Question of Power was submitted by Mr. Williams to the Commission. Using the literature as a guide, the attorney who represents the interests of the PNC also sought to suggest that the WPA's contention that Sergeant William Gregory Smith was responsible for Rodney's death is baseless. To this end, Mr. Kwayana argued that this analogy was inaccurate, as CLR James was misinformed and was not in Guyana at the time Dr. Rodney was assassinated. The passage of the book found on page 139 reads, and I quote, The second point where Walter was wrong is that although he was aware of the lack of revolutionary experience and revolutionary temper among the leaders whom he had, he did not train them and spend every minute of the day training them in the essentials, not of Marxism in general, but of the taking of power, because the question of the taking of power is a question thousands of years old. It does not depend on the knowledge of Marxism. It is a knowledge that there is somebody waiting to destroy you. But Walter did not do that. Instead, he took on all sorts of activities on the conception that he had to show them that he was not asking anybody to do anything that he would not do himself. That is why Walter found himself in a car with a member of Burnham's army making some arrangement about some gadget that turned out to be an explosive, unquote.
Do you agree with the assessment of the great CLR James in that passage I read you, Mr. UC?
I do not. I have the utmost regard for CLR James, who is also one of my mentors, but in the facts there, he was misinformed. He was not present in Guyana, he was misinformed, and I told him and explained that to him later. Because there was no report, even from the government of Guyana or anyone, that Walter Rodney had sat in a car with Gregory Smith, who I suppose is the agent of Burnham's army. There was no such knowledge until 2007, no such claim.
On several occasions, the commissioners had to object to Mr. Williams' line of questioning as it did not relate to the terms of reference. Chairman of the commission, Sir Richard Cheltenham, informed Williams that persons are granted latitude, but warned that this privilege should not be abused during the cross-examination.
He is saying that he didn't have that revolutionary support base of the people to temper any insurrection against the government. Do you agree with that?
I prefer you to put the words as read.
That's the word. Oh, you want me to read them again? Let me do that. Walter became too nervous, too anxious about it. He did not wait for the revolutionary people and the revolutionary class to be in conflict with the government before he could start the question of the insurrection.
I agree that that is a quotation from CLR James.
No, but I went past that and I was asking you if you agreed that Walter Rodney at the time did not have any support, any mass-based support of the people in conflict with the government of the day.
I do not agree with that. That is...
So you disagree with CLR James's...
Yes, I do, on that
assertion.
point. Yeah.
He was speaking also of an insurrection. Do you agree that with that his belief that Walter was had involved undertaking an insurrection at the time in Guyana?
That Walter was engaged in an insurrection?
Yes.
This was not my impression, being one of the company in Guyana. I can describe it, but I never heard that word flung about.
So,
Mr. Williams, you need to remind us as to the relevance of the line you are pursuing to the terms of reference.
well, isn't that the atmosphere at the time we dealing with?
But how is James, a quote from James related to the atmosphere of the time?
Well, the witness let, as we say in the law, let the evidence in when he said, in explaining by any means necessary, and he took us back to 1861, an interview with Marx, and he also said at the end of that Dr. Rodney was a student of CLR James.
Yeah, but the fact
And in
that
doing that, he has made it possible for me to introduce what I have on CLR's position about Dr. Rodney.
Yeah, he might have made it possible for you, but that doesn't mean it's relevant in terms of reference.
But
everything said must not be answered, and because it was said, you accept that.
Senior Counsel and Commissioner Sinat Jairam also questioned the logical conclusion that would be derived.
What is logical, Mr. Williams? You use a turn of phrase that Dr. Rodney was in conflict and confrontation with the government of the day. What is the logical conclusion of that?
That he coordinated his activities as he declared, to get rid of them by any means necessary.
And
adopted acts in pursuance of doing that.
And what, sorry?
Adopted acts or activities in pursuance thereof.
And how are we to sift that in relation to his
Sir,
death?
one of the activity was the tinkering with the walkie-talkie, which we don't know, I wasn't in the car, but which, as a result of what Gary Smith is saying, there was an explosion.
I see. So
that's what I'm trying to show. That's
know,
why I'm saying I wanted everything to come in the context here rather than going off on something
else.
I
now follow you with that phrase.
Thank you, sir.
During the cross-examination by the lawyer representing the interests of Dr. Walter Rodney's family, Andrew Pilgrim, Mr. Kwayana maintained that his position as it relates to extrajudicial killings, the equality of races, and condemnation of state harassment remains the same today. Kwayana dismissed claims that the wife of the late Dr. Walter Rodney, Patricia Rodney, visited Sergeant Gregory Smith. Subjected to the cross-examination by Mr. Pilgrim, Kwayana clearly outlined his interpretation of the speech by Walter Rodney. The struggle goes on.
They have been accusing us of fermenting violence. They have even had the temerity to say that we are working up hit lists, assassination lists, on which the name of the Prime Minister and Hammy Green and so on appear. Someone who heard that was speaking to me the other day said, well, if all you really intend to assassinate them fellas, I'll tell you something, you gotta join the queue. There's laughter. Is it correct to say, as you understand it, that in this speech, Walter Rodney was saying assassination is not the way to go?
Quite correct, and in fact he said it explicitly in that same speech, in another portion.
The former political activist was also cross-examined by the lawyer representing the interests of brother of the late Dr. Walter Rodney, Donald Rodney, who sought to establish that Donald Rodney was subjected to discrimination under the Burnham regime and denied his rights as contained in the 1966 Right to Life Constitution, which was still in effect until it was amended in October 1980.
At paragraph 13 page 13 of your witness statement, you made references to Donald Rodney when you said, the point has been made elsewhere in this testimony that the charge against Donald Rodney was discriminatory on the part of the 1980 DPP. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
Now, before I was interrupted, and I'm sorry for moving off of that trend of thought, I will go back to that. You mentioned throughout page 13 of the witness statement, fourth part, you mentioned throughout your dissertation the concept of the right to life. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
And it's a repeating theme that exists with you even now.
Yes, it is.
It is true to say that existing in Guyana in June 1980 was a constitution that recognized the right to life.
That is correct.
It was also revealed that Gregory Smith admitted that he was responsible for the construction of the device that killed Walter. Mr. Kwayana was for the first time cross-examined by Christopher Ram, who represents the interests of the Working People's Alliance, who asks that Mr. Kwayana give an explanation of what he meant by ethnic insecurity during that time.
In paragraph 4 of page 4 of your statement, one of the issues identified to this commission was ethnic insecurity. Would you care to tell this commission what you mean by the term ethnic insecurity?
The fact that in Mr. Counsel, the fact that in Guyana, as a multi-ethnic country, over the decades, both before and after independence, there are concerns among ethnic groups and ethnic organizations about their future and their safety in relation to the governmental power and in relation also to social influences and almost everything that comprises the whole society. So it plays a very, very important part in the political life. In Guyana, that is where I think things come to a head. And it can hardly be ignored wisely. It cannot be wisely ignored in Guyana in the political sphere. In around 1980, there was a government in power, in control of Guyana, and it had been there since 1965. It had re-established itself in very, very controversial elections, which have been deemed illicit by groups of observers who are often not welcome into the country.
Assistant Lead Counsel to the Commission, Lakshmi Rahamat, summarized Day 4, Round 2.
A summary of today's proceedings: we saw Mr. Kwayana under cross-examination. Mr. Williams completed his cross-examination. We have Mr. Pilgrim, who's representing the family of Dr. Rodney, completing his cross-examination. We also saw Mrs. Scotland, who is representing Donald Rodney, complete his cross-examination. And we have Mr. Ram representing the interests of the WPA, who is incomplete with his cross-examination. Some of the highlights of what came out today in the evidence is that the writings of one CLR James, was referred to during the cross-examination of Mr. Williams and was also referred to during the cross-examination of Mrs. Scotland. In the piece that was written by Mr. James, he made reference to a conversation that he had with Mr. Rodney, where he told Mr. Rodney, beware of assassination because Burnham will kill you. You are someone who could represent the people against him. We have the witness in the box, Mr. Kwayana, who said that he actually spoke to CLR James, and CLR James told him that he did in fact warn Rodney that he would be killed. We also have, coming out from the evidence of the cross-examination by Mrs. Scotland, is that there was evidence according to Mr. Kwayana of state involvement, and again it was summed up in 3 particular points: the fact that the guards were removed and only state agencies could have facilitated the moving of the guards from around Camp Street prison. Secondly, you have the fact that Mr. Gregory Smith was not charged, he was not in any way captured, but in fact there were facilities which were activated, and these agencies which were referred to during the cross-examination assisted. He left in a GDF plane according to the reports which were referred to in evidence today. And what was evident from these 3 elements which were looked at was that there was indeed state involvement in order to achieve certain things, that is, Gregory Smith leaving the country. I believe that Mr. Kwayana's evidence was very rich in terms of giving a highlight and a background in relation to the political atmosphere as it existed between the period 1978-1980. This is very relevant in relation to the term of reference number 4, which speaks to the atmosphere, both political, social, economical, that existed back in that time period. His evidence comes as a wealth of knowledge from someone who lived in the country and again who has been as a member of the political parties, starting from the PNC, then to the PPP, and then in the WPA. So his evidence is very rich, and I believe the commissioners may be inclined to put weight on his evidence in relation to the political atmosphere when it comes to the time when they're writing their reports. We also have coming from Mr. Kwayana through the cross-examination of Mr. Ram, which is still incomplete, his reference to there being electoral rigging in 1973. He made reference to the fact that there were observers who were present in the country during those elections who published a document which stated what their account of what the actual polls would have or should have reflected. We would be making efforts to try to get those particular documents or those reports which were done by the observers to attempt to verify whether or not the figures that were referred to in evidence is actually there in the observer's report. The fact that there may have been electoral rigging in that time, Mr. Kwayana referred to it as one of the ways in which ethnic insecurity was being dealt with by the ruling party at the time. He gave a definition or his interpretation of what ethnic insecurity back in that time, the period 1980-1978, meant. Because in his written statement, which was tendered before the commission, he makes reference to that term. This term, he said to the members of the commission today, speaks about the multiracial society that we have in Guyana, and how at one point in time they were saying that because of the racial divide, because of the ethnicity of certain people and certain party lines, one particular party would have always ended up with the majority. I believe what can be inferred from what has been said is that perhaps this rigged election could have been another contributing factor toward the tensions that were being raised. Because what Mr. Kwayana has said from the beginning of his evidence is that Walter Rodney had as a core in what his party was trying to do was to change the lives of the working people, because the regime at the time was not taking into consideration how these policies were affecting the lives of the working people.
Round 2 of the Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry public hearings will continue on Monday, June the 2nd. Major General retired Norman McLean, who served as Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defense Force, is expected to give his testimony on June 3rd, as informed by the chairman of the commission.